The snow hit my face like 100 tiny knives the night my mother told me I was no longer her daughter. And 18 years later, my father walked into my boardroom in downtown Toronto, wearing a coat that cost more than the shelter bed I slept in that winter, demanding to meet a grandson who never lived past his first breath. My name doesn't matter as much as what I built with it. I'm 33 now, and I run a private equity firm on Bay Street that manages just over $400 million in assets, most of it tied up in healthcare real estate and long-term care facilities across Ontario. Before you keep watching, tell me where you're tuning in from tonight, and if you've ever had to build a life from nothing after the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally decided you weren't worth the trouble. Hit that like button. Because this one's for you. For 18 years I didn't have a last name that meant anything to anyone outside my office. I made sure of it. I changed it the day I turned 19, scrubbed every trace of my parents off every document I could touch, and built something so solid that nobody could ever again look at me the way my mother looked at me on that porch in November, the way you'd look at a stain you couldn't get out of the carpet. My office took up the northeast corner of the 32nd floor, glass on two sides, looking out over the lake on a clear day, over the financial district's gray towers on the gray ones, which in Toronto is most of them. I kept it sparse. A desk, 2 chairs, a credenza with exactly 3 photographs on it, my husband Holden, our daughter Briar, and a framed picture of the first check I ever earned, $11.40, from cleaning tables at a diner on Danforth, when I was 17 and 6 months pregnant and had nowhere else to be at 5 in the morning. It was a Thursday, the kind of unremarkable Thursday where the worst thing on your calendar is a budget call with the Alberta team, when my assistant Genevieve buzzed my line with a voice that didn't sound like her at all. "There's a situation downstairs," she said. 2 people, they're refusing to leave the lobby. Security's involved. Who are they? They say they're your parents. I sat very still for a moment, the way you do when your body remembers something your mind has spent 2 decades trying to forget. Then I told her to have security walk them to the small conference room on the 14th floor, not my office, and to tell them I'd be down in 20 minutes. I needed those 20 minutes. I spent them in the washroom with the door locked, breathing the way my therapist taught me, 4 counts in, hold for 7, out for 8, until my hands stopped shaking enough to hold a pen. I hadn't seen my mother or my father since the night they put 2 garbage bags of my clothes on the front step of our house in Etobicoke, and told me that a daughter who'd disgraced the family like this wasn't a daughter at all. I was 17. It was minus 11 degrees with the wind chill, and I stood on that step for 40 minutes ringing the bell, certain that this was some kind of test, that any second my mother would open the door and pull me inside and tell me everything would be fine. She never opened the door. My father watched from the living room window with his arms crossed, the same posture I'd see again 18 years later, like time had simply paused him in that exact position and was now hitting play. The boy's father had already left for university in Kingston 2 weeks earlier the moment I told him. He didn't even ask if I was keeping it. He just stopped answering his phone. I walked from a youth shelter near Sherbourne to a Tim Hortons every morning that winter to use the washroom before my shift at the diner, because the shelter's facilities were always backed up by 6 a.m. I gave birth alone in a labor and delivery ward at St. Michael's in April, 14 hours, no family in the waiting room, just a kind nurse named Audalis, who held my hand through the worst of it because there was nobody else's hand to hold. My son lived for 19 minutes. There was a cord complication nobody caught in time, the kind of thing that happens in maybe 1 in 1,000 births, and there was nothing the doctors could have done differently. And I have spent 18 years not blaming myself for something my brain still blames myself for, at 3 in the morning sometimes. My parents never knew any of this. They never asked. As far as they were concerned, they'd thrown out a pregnant teenager and washed their hands of the consequence, and whatever happened to that consequence afterward simply wasn't their problem. So when I walked into that 14th floor conference room and found my mother in a cream wool coat that still smelled like the same department store perfume counter, and my father standing by the window with his arms crossed exactly the way I remembered, the first words out of my mother's mouth were not hello, and they were not I'm sorry. "Where is he?" she said. Not a question, a demand sharp enough to cut. I set my tablet down on the table very slowly. "Where is who? Don't play games with me, the boy. Our grandson. We know you had him." We need to see him. I looked at my father, who hadn't moved from the window, who still hadn't said a single word to me. Not hello, not how have you been, not anything resembling the 18 years that had passed since he'd watched me freeze on our front step without lifting a finger. Why, I asked very quietly, after 18 years of nothing, no calls, no letters, not even a birthday card. Would you suddenly need to see a child you've never once asked about? That's when my father finally turned around, and I saw it in his face before my mother said a word. Calculation. The same look he used to get at the dinner table when he was deciding whether a business deal was worth the risk. Your brother is sick, he said. Tobias needs a liver. He's been on the transplant list at Toronto General for 14 months and his numbers are getting worse. A living donor match from a blood relative would move everything forward. We did the math. The boy would be 18 now, he'd be a perfect candidate. I actually laughed. It came out of me before I could stop it, a short, ugly sound that startled even me, because the audacity of it was almost beautiful in how complete it was. They hadn't tracked me down because they missed me. They hadn't spent 18 years wondering if I was alive, if I was safe, if I'd survived that winter at all. They'd done arithmetic. They'd calculated that the baby they once called a mistake that's going to ruin this family's reputation might now be a tissue match for their golden son, the one who'd never worked a day he didn't want to, the one who got the car in the condo and the second chances while I got 2 garbage bags on a porch. You threw a pregnant 17-year-old out into a snowstorm, I said, and 18 years later. The only reason you came looking for either of us is that you need spare parts. My mother's face went tight with something that almost looked like shame before it hardened back into the same disdain I remembered from childhood. The look she'd give the help, the look she'd give me. Don't be dramatic. This is your brother's life. Family helps family. You taught me that family doesn't help family, I said. You taught me that very clearly, on a Tuesday in November when I was 17 and had nowhere to sleep. I told them I'd take them to him. I watched my mother's eyes light up. Watched her glance at my father with something close to triumph, the two of them believing for one brief moment that 18 years of stone-cold silence and an entire winter spent letting their daughter nearly freeze to death had simply been forgotten, erased by their need. I drove them myself, not to my house, to Mount Pleasant Cemetery, to a small granite marker near the eastern fence line, a single name and 2 dates 18 years and 19 minutes apart. A stone I paid for with the first real bonus I ever earned. Back when I was 23 and still working 60-hour weeks at an analyst desk and crying in the stairwell every April on his birthday, my mother read the dates twice before she understood. I watched the color drain out of her face the way water drains from a basin, slow and then all at once. He died, she whispered. The night you threw me out, yes. He was born premature, alone, in a hospital where I had no one because you made sure of that. He lived 19 minutes. I named him myself because nobody else was there to help me choose. My father said nothing. For the first time in my life I watched him have nothing to say at all. I should have felt satisfied. Instead I felt the old cold returning, the porch step cold, the cold of standing in front of people who built their entire understanding of you around what you could provide them rather than who you actually were. My mother started crying, but I'd learned a long time ago that my mother's tears were rarely for anyone but herself. And these were no exception. She wasn't crying for the grandson she'd never know. She was crying because her plan had failed. Then we need you, my father said, recovering faster than I expected, his voice already shifting back into the register he used for negotiations. You could be a match, half siblings sometimes. No, I said, he's your brother. He's dying. He's a stranger who got everything I never had, including parents who loved him enough to fight for him. I am not donating anything to a family that left me to die in a snowstorm at 17. My mother's composure cracked entirely then, the careful suburban polish stripping away to something raw and desperate. You'd let your own brother die out of spite? I'd let my own brother live or die based on what every other unrelated Canadian on that transplant list has to rely on. The system. And whether a real match comes through it. The same system everyone else has to wait for. You don't get to skip the line because you finally remembered you have a daughter. What neither of them knew, what I hadn't planned on revealing that day, not yet, not like this, was that I'd already known about my father's financial situation for months. Long before they showed up in my lobby, My firm had been quietly approached by a smaller asset management group looking for a buyer. A group that turned out, after some very careful due diligence by my team, to be heavily intertwined with my father's property management company. The kind of intertwine that happens when a man has spent a decade siphoning maintenance reserve funds from senior care residences he managed across the GTA to cover his son's gambling debts and his wife's renovations, falsifying the reports that go to the provincial regulator every year, betting that nobody connected enough would ever look closely. I was connected enough, I'd looked very closely. There was a gala 2 weeks later, a fundraiser for the very transplant program my brother was on the waiting list for, hosted at the Royal York, the kind of event where my father had spent years cultivating the image of a generous community pillar, donating just enough to get his name on a plaque, never enough to actually move the needle. He'd be there. My mother would be there in a new gown bought with money that should have gone to fixing broken fire systems in a long-term care home in Scarborough. My brother would be there too, frail now, tethered to an oxygen line, the golden boy finally looking like what years of being protected from consequence actually costs a person. I was on the host committee that year. I always am. My firm funds a significant piece of the hospital's research wing, the kind of donation that gets you a seat at the head table, and more usefully, gets you 15 minutes at the podium. I used those 15 minutes differently than anyone expected. I talked first about the transplant program, about wait lists, about the quiet heroism of living donors who give up a piece of themselves for strangers and family alike. Then I talked about trust, about institutions Canadians are taught to believe will protect their elderly parents, their grandparents, the most vulnerable people in their lives. And then I put the first slide up on the screen behind me. Falsified maintenance audits. Reserve fund withdrawals that didn't match any approved capital project. An internal memo leaked to my firm during due diligence, in which my father explicitly instructed a junior accountant to smooth the numbers before the provincial inspection. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The room did that for me, 200 people in black tie going dead silent except for the sound of phones quietly coming out of clutch bags. My father stood up halfway through, his face the color of the tablecloths, and tried to leave. Security. My security, the same firm that had walked him and my mother to that 14th floor conference room 2 weeks earlier, was already at the doors. By the following Monday, the provincial regulator had opened a formal investigation into 3 of his properties. By the following month, the licenses for 2 of them were suspended pending review, and a class action on behalf of residents and their families was already being assembled by a firm I'd quietly recommended to a journalist who'd been circling the story for over a year and finally had the documentation to run with it. My mother called me 4 times in the weeks after. I let every call go to voicemail. The last one I still have saved, though I've never told Holden that. In it, her voice cracks in a way I never once heard growing up, and she says, "I don't expect you to forgive us. I just need you to know I think about that porch every single day." I don't know if I believe her. I don't know that it matters anymore whether I do. My brother didn't get my father's transplant fund, because by then there wasn't one left to give. Every dollar that might have paid for a private clinic consult or expedited testing somewhere else had already been swallowed by legal fees and frozen assets. He stayed on the public wait list, like everyone else, and as far as I know, he's still on it, which feels less like punishment and more like the universe finally treating my family the way they always should have been treated, like ordinary people, accountable to the same rules as everyone else. I drove home that night across the Gardiner, with the lake black and flat on my right, the city lights smearing across the windshield through a light snow that had just started to fall. The kind of late autumn snow that always makes my chest tighten a little before I remember I'm not 17 anymore. I'm not on a porch, I have somewhere warm to go. Holden had the kettle on when I walked in. Briar was at the kitchen table doing homework, 16 years old, sharp-tongued and kind in exactly the way I'd hoped a daughter of mine would be, the daughter we adopted 9 years ago when she was 7, and nobody else's plan for her had worked out, and who I sometimes think saved as much of me as I ever gave to her. I didn't tell her where I'd been that day, not the details, not yet. She's old enough now that one day I will. I sat down across from her, and she slid her math homework toward me and asked if I could check her work, and I did, because that's what the people who actually stay choose to do, the small, unglamorous daily choosing, over and over. That my parents never once managed in 17 years and that I've now managed for 9, and intend to manage for the rest of my life. Blood doesn't make you family. It never did, not really, no matter how many holiday cards insist otherwise. Family is the people who stay on the porch with you in the snow instead of watching from behind the glass. If the people who were supposed to protect you left you out in the cold instead, you are allowed to build a door they don't get a key to. No matter how loudly they knock, no matter how many years later, no matter what they finally decide they need from you. I built mine. It's still standing. And every night I lock it myself.